welcome to 2023, everyone.
Hello.
I'm Daniela from Araujo Attorneys. Good morning, and we are here at Brewed Coffee at SMG Rocks in Umhlanga.
Yeah.
So happy January, and we are here on a Thursday.
Date has changed, eh?
Date has changed.
Used to be Tuesday.
Used to be Tuesday because in the beginning I just thought it would be nice and a quick 5-minute chat, and obviously as we realised it's never 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And we've always got our meeting at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday.
So it's always a rush.
So it just ended up being overlapped. So that's why I thought new start, new year, we'll move it to Thursday. So
Nice.
Thursday, 8:30, new slot. No rushing to any meetings afterwards, and we can enjoy our coffee.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
delicious coffee.
yes. And I just want to say up front, thank you for my lovely socks. And let's just let the truck go past. Have a sip of coffee. That's always the fun part when we are in the lives. There's always, there's load shedding, there's trucks, there's
Something
noise,
or
there's
other.
always something that we can never quite anticipate, but that's the beauty of life.
Yeah.
So, Daniela, I asked you to come to me today again. Thank you. You always come through on the tough ones. Because I had an interesting one in December with occupation and possession on the 31st of, well, occupation on the 31st of December,
And
transfers still about to take place. So it raised a couple of interesting queries, and then there was also one that we dealt with last year where the purchases had moved in prior as well, and so I just thought quite pertinent to discuss occupation, what happens, occupational rent, etc., etc. So just a couple of the basics for our little 5 minutes.
Yes.
Do you want to come closer this way, and then we both, other way,
This way.
that way. Okay. There we go. Okay, we're all settled in. Yeah, perfect. Right, so I brought the sale agreement with just for reference because I wanted to read it correctly.
Yeah.
And obviously this is our sale agreement. This is not everybody's sale agreement is worded exactly the same way.
Yeah,
Is
but
that
pretty
correct?
much, yeah, not exactly the same, but pretty much the concepts would be the same. The same would apply. Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of occupation.
So in terms of on a sale agreement, date of possession is registration of transfer. So what does that mean?
So date of possession is exactly that, what possession is. So the purchaser is getting possession of the property. So all risk, benefits and ownership passes on to the purchaser. Prior to transfer, all risk and benefits and ownership still vests with the seller.
Okay.
And then,
because I've got that down there, which will touch more on what risk and benefit is a bit later, if that's okay. But that stays with the seller. So that's date of possession is registration of transfer.
Correct.
So what if date of occupation shall be, and then we've got it blank, because we usually put it as registration of transfer, but in some instances there is a specific date that somebody will move out. The seller might still be in there after transfer, or the purchaser might move in before transfer.
Yeah, so occupation then is exactly that. You're occupying the property. So then it falls to the sort of landlord-tenant type of situation.
Okay.
So the person, you put a date in the sale agreement for whatever reason, the person's going overseas, the purchaser's lease where they are is ending and they need to, and the parties agree to an occupation date.
Yes.
We don't generally like to see occupation dates in sale agreement, but obviously it's not always, sometimes you have to have it because whatever the circumstances are for the parties, or if it's a delayed sale, or a lot of the time we're finding occupation now where the sellers are actually moving overseas.
Okay.
And they have a set date that they're moving. They book their ticket for the 1st of March. The transfer goes through in January, and then they stay on afterwards.
Okay.
So sometimes we're finding a lot now the sellers are actually staying on afterwards. And
okay. Because then obviously it goes on to say, should occupation not coincide with the date of registration of transfer, the party enjoying occupation of the property while registered in the name of the other party shall pay to the other party for the period of such occupation set amount per month in advance direct to the conveyancers. So this is always quite an interesting one because, I'm Schlanger.
yeah,
All the
racing
racing along
in the morning.
So in that clause there, at one stage we always used to just put in there an amount to be decided on at a later stage. But I've started upfront in the negotiation let's all agree on a rental upfront, even if it still says registration of transfer. So that there's no hoo-ha down the line.
So always put in, even that's exactly it. Even if you have dates for registration of transfer, because you can always agree afterwards in an addendum. If there is a couple of days occupational or situation changes with the parties and they do agree to an occupation date, then we can do an addendum to set a date. But it's always difficult in the transfer to then negotiate the occupational rental, because obviously whoever it's benefiting is going to want more. So if the purchaser's in, they're going to want to pay less, and the seller's going to want to have more occupational rental. And definitely if the seller's staying in, they want to pay less, because they're like, oh, I'm still staying in my home. Why must I pay to stay in my home? I didn't have a bond over my property. Now I must be paying. So they want to pay as little as possible.
Which is one of my questions is, occupational rent is always that touchy subject. And how do you suggest we work it out? Because I know how I always guide people, but
so
what
we
do you
always
suggest?
say that the general or practice is between 0.5% and 1% of the purchase price.
Okay.
So then that generally works out to that we start as like the base point almost. So obviously the higher the purchase price, the closer you are to 0.5%. And then the lower the purchase price, the closer.
So for instance, then on a 5 million rand home, for example, what would that be? Like 50,000 rand a month as 1%, because it's also
that would be 1%. So then you could also go down in the range to 25 to 30%.
Okay.
So I would start from there, and then that's where your negotiating point is. Because sometimes you'll get a seller that will say no, they want whatever their bond repayment is, but maybe that's exorbitant. Or maybe it's too little.
That's what I was going to say as well, is if you've got somebody moving in and the bond installment is 50,000 rand a month, and then somebody's only offering 25,000 rand a month, it's not really beneficial.
No,
so you've got to sort of come
so it depends
to that agreement
on the circumstances
and the price.
But I'll definitely say agree that upfront in your sale agreement, because we see lots and lots of times where agents won't put that occupational rental in, and I'll say to them, oh, I see that it's been left blank, or it says no, and they say, oh no, but the parties, it's on registration, they don't want occupation. But it always comes to sometimes when, you know what it's like, when it's moving dates, if there's public holidays, if it's over Easter or Christmas, there's always times where movers are closed or it's more expensive. So even if it's a week of occupational rental, there's still then, if it's not in there, it still becomes a negotiation
closer to the time. And then that's when already everybody's heated because they're packing boxes and they're stressed and everything. So rather get it done up front. So obviously in the sale agreement it says it's monthly in advance, but we know it's never a full month. It's always worked out pro rata.
Correct.
Can you just explain how that calculation works? And
so we will always call for the month in advance from whoever's paying.
And that gets paid to you?
To us, So for the purchaser, we'll ask them to pay before they move in, that first month. And then the seller, generally we make provision that there are enough from the proceeds of the sale so that we can pay over to the purchaser. Otherwise, they can also upfront that to us so that we can, if it's going to be for an extended period, the sellers are staying on for 3 or 4 months and those purchasers want that monthly, we can give it to them monthly. Or we pay it to them as a lump sum when it registers. I lost my train of thought.
What was the pro rata? How does it work out? How do you work it roughly?
So we basically, so if it's 20,000 rand for the month, that we will then divide by the number of days in that month, and then
so February's a really bad month for occupational rental
because you're paying more per day. And then you times it by how many days that the purchaser or the seller has stayed in, and then we refund accordingly.
Yes, how's the kind of news, Steve? We're on our live. How are you? Well done on your new coffee shop, everyone. This is Steve, the owner of Brewed Coffee. So that's fine. All good. Thank you. I'll see you just now. Yeah, anyway, you see what happens on these labs, all these wonderful things. You may have a sip of your coffee in between.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were saying, so 31, so normally it's 31 in the months, or 28, or 30 divided by however many days, and then
so
if
they per day,
7 days, for example, then they would just get refunded whatever is outstanding.
Yeah, but we always call for it upfront.
Okay, the full month. And then I did read through the contract again, because every now and then you forget to read through everything because you think you know it all. And it actually says in there that if it's longer than a month, then instead of it being paid to you, it can then be paid over to either the seller or purchaser, whoever owns the property at the time.
Yes.
Okay. So just an interesting one as well. So what happens with a tenant? So if the transfer of the property has happened, the tenant is going to stay on for a month or two and, carry on with the lease agreement. What happens with the deposit, the tenant's deposit? Because that would have accrued interest.
Correct.
And then who gets it? Or does it?
So we always make sure when, that's why one of the questions we ask our sellers when we get a sale agreement that comes in, and it's also good for you as agents to know. And I think there is a clause, I know on Remax there's a clause that if there is a tenant in the property and if there will be a lease.
Yes.
Because it's very important for us as attorneys to know that we ask them, is there going to be a tenant? How much rental are they paying? And have they paid a deposit? How much? And where is it sitting?
Okay.
So then we can ask those questions to the seller. We either say to the seller, you let us know what that deposit amount is plus the interest, and we can pay that directly to the purchaser from the proceeds, or are you going to transfer that across, or is the tenant going to sort that out with the purchaser? Is the seller going to refund the tenant going to pay the purchaser?
Okay, so you help with all of that coordination.
Because everyone's different. There's no set rule about what you need to do with that, but obviously we need to make sure that if the purchaser is taking on the lease, then obviously that purchaser gets the deposit then. Because obviously then if that tenant leaves a month later and they've damaged the property, the purchaser doesn't have any recourse.
And then what happens if there's a lease that's still in place? Do some people sign a new lease with the new owner, or does that lease just
so you don't have to sign a new lease? You basically step into the shoes of that new owner. You can sign, but it would have to be on the same terms as the previous lease.
And for the same duration, and then only at the end of that duration renegotiate any rental amounts, etc.
You can obviously do like an addendum to change various things like the banking details and your name on the lease. But all other terms have to stay in place.
All right. And then an interesting one which you touched on earlier was the risk and benefits, which is then, I would imagine, is insurance and electricity and water and pool pump. And all of those wonderful things that normally go wrong in transfer processes.
So that's why we don't generally like to see that there's an occupation date on sale agreements, because as we know, just human nature, and again, it's also how people use property. Sometimes you might get a home it's just been a single little old lady that's been living in the home, and she doesn't switch on all the aircon, she doesn't use everything. And then a family of 5 come to live there, and they're using the aircons every day, and now suddenly something breaks, the aircon's not working anymore, and it was working before, and now it's not working. It's
now just like a system overload potentially. Or something.
And now the seller, unfortunately, if the purchaser has taken early occupation, the seller is now liable for that, because again, it would be the same if you're a landlord-tenant. The landlord is responsible still for the maintenance and upkeep of the property. Obviously, if the purchaser moves into the property and they're there for a month or two, things like cutting the grass and keeping the pool clean and stuff like that, that's
And what happens if the pool cleaner breaks in that time?
Then the seller legally is liable for it.
Purchase a replacement one.
Correct, but there could be the argument that, well, you're using it, and so that's why it's sort of it's a grey area. There is obviously a legal standpoint that you can take, but it always just becomes a little bit ends the transfer off a little bit not so nicely. So it's better just to avoid that completely. And we all know once people move into a property, then they maybe start nitpicking at certain things. And then it's harder then to also explain to a purchaser that, you know, Voetstoots is Voetstoots. What you saw when you had a chance to inspect the property when you were there. So now you can't come because you're living there 24/7. Now you can't come and nitpick. And
nitpick on all the little things, and the door handle not potentially working
and
properly,
the window
and
not
all the little nuances that happen in old homes.
And the thing is, I always say to some purchasers, especially when it's little nitpicking things like that, what's good for one is not necessarily good for another. So someone who lives in a house and their door is creaking all the time and you have to pull it a little bit harder, maybe lift the door to lock it, to them maybe that's fine. It's the door still has its function, it still closes, it still locks. But to someone else, oh no, they must have a smooth closing door and lock it properly, you know. So then where is it broken, or is it just not?
Because it works. It works. I mean, technically it's in working order. So you can open and close and you can unlock. It's just
exactly. So it's not broken. If it's broken, I agree. But then, so I always say that to clients often when they come with those little things, you know, what's good to someone is not good necessarily to another. And the same with cleaning. If there's some people say, oh no, they left the house in absolute state, and some people are very clean and other people are not. So
exactly,
it's just one of those things.
And then in terms of insurance, because I had an interesting this one in December now, where she said there were tenants in place and the tenants vacated and the purchasers now moved in prior to transfer. And the registered owner still was like, but insurance, you know, she needs to make sure that the alarm is all up and running and this and that, whatever have you, for insurance purposes. But there was no alarm in the house to start with. So I'm going, but it's no different, because you still have to cover the home with insurance until registration of transfer, regardless of who's living in there. Is that correct?
So the seller is still liable because they're still in possession of the property. So the risk is still with them. So if anything had to happen to the property, if there was a flood, if we had, who knows, in KZN now, we could have a hurricane or something and a wind.
I know, we moved like 100 kilometers from the sun in the last 2 weeks. We're so close.
So your tiles blew off on your roof, there was a leak, whatever. The seller, even though they've moved out of the property and they're not living there, they still the beneficial owner of the property. So they still need to have their insurance over the property. So generally that will still stay in place if they've got a bond over the property, because usually that comes, they have to have insurance as part of their home policy over the property. And if there's no bond on the property, you need to tell your sellers, don't cancel your insurance over the property for your building insurance. But they can cancel if they've moved out and they've moved their possessions out of their furniture, their movable possessions out of the property. They obviously can cancel that insurance.
So the household contents
insurance they can cancel, but not the building insurance. And then obviously similarly for the purchaser who's moving in, they will have cover of the building insurance from the seller's side, but then they need to have household contents insurance obviously for all their things that are in the home.
And then, so then just going back then to the alarm, so there was no alarm system connected and in working order, and she's saying, well, the purchaser must now get the alarm sorted out, but it hasn't transferred into the purchaser's name yet. So
she can't get anything.
Couldn't technically do it. I mean, she can do it obviously because she's going to be, but if there was an alarm in the house, would the seller still have to be paying that alarm fee during the transfer process?
No, I would say no. It would be the purchaser, because that would be almost covering their household contents. Yeah, so it wouldn't be covering the building insurance. So, but you do get that instance where the sellers, and it is a bit tricky because the sellers then say, well, I've moved out, I'm going to cancel my marshal, I'm going to cancel my blue security, all of that. And then generally at that point you can either say, okay, well, the purchasers, they can either take that over from then if those companies are willing to do that. Or, which is the case because usually tenants can get alarms in properties even if it's not their property. Or otherwise, the purchaser just pays, if it's for 6 months or whatever it is, the purchaser can then just pay that monthly fee,
yes.
you know, compensate the seller for that.
Yes, and then we at Remax have got that 4 months with Marshall free monitoring as well for the alarm system, which we give to our clients as well. And then just lastly, then I've noticed there in terms of electricity rates and water, that is still the seller's responsibility because the municipal bill cannot be transferred until transfer anyway.
Yes.
So we have to then take photos and all of that on date of occupation.
Yes, so rates definitely still for the seller's account because they are the beneficial owner, like you said. Utilities, so electricity and water, that can be negotiated, and often that is also a point of discussion or negotiation when it comes to a little bit of an argument between the parties, because agents might put an occupational rental amount, but then they don't state whether it includes or excludes utilities. And obviously then if the purchaser is staying on, the seller wants the purchaser to pay utilities, because like I said, you might get a family of 5 coming in and air cons, and then they ring up the electricity bill. 100%. Or then the other way around, the purchaser, the seller doesn't want to pay the purchaser won't want to pay utilities, obviously, and they say, no, it's all inclusive in there. So it's very important for agents to stipulate. I know some agreements come standard. I think the Remax one, it says
per month in advance direction the conveyances, and then
is on the other page.
Just trying to double check which one it is then.
I think Remax says included.
Which clause is that under? Just trying to see there. Oh, risk and benefits.
Yeah.
Risk and benefits there. Pay all the risk.
To pay all rates and taxes.
Shall pass to the purchaser on transfer. And then see there.
Yeah, so if occupation is longer than 1 month prior to registration, then the seller shall be entitled to claim directly from the purchaser repayments for utility supply on the seller's account.
Yes.
So there again, it's a little bit grey, and then sometimes they're like, oh, but what about my utilities?
Yes.
And if you don't state it, it's then just automatically included.
So, and then levies, because on sectional title, I see it, there is a thing on our...
So levies would still be for the seller's account.
Okay, so it's definitely rates and levies are for the seller.
Unless obviously you negotiate otherwise. I have seen where a purchaser is paid for levies as well, but I mean that's obviously
not the norm.
If the parties are agreeable to that, then they can. But yeah, I would say you definitely need to make sure that if you haven't got an occupation date set, you still put an occupational rental amount that's stated, and make the parties aware of it. So don't just put it in automatically, because often we get to the case where the seller or the purchaser will say to me, oh, but where did you get that amount from? That's not what I discussed, or that's not what I agreed to. And then, I mean, obviously the sale agreement is gold. What's written in there is what has to be. So make sure that they both see that. Maybe they initial next to
I was going to ask, can they initial to highlight it?
Yes, to bring it to their attention. And then also to state whether utilities are included or excluded. So everyone from the onset know, okay, my occupational rental is going to be 20,000 Rand, but it's going to exclude utilities. And then that's easy. That's something we can also work out. We can usually do an average, or we take the last bill of the seller and we calculate that, and then we pay that accordingly from the proceeds or from the amount that the purchaser's paid.
So just obviously if the occupation isn't on transfer, just to really highlight to everybody what the risk and benefits are, and maybe just, you know, pop an extra little email through with everything so that they can refer to it, or certainly remind them of it closer to the time as well. Of what's happening. But thank you. Anything else? All good.
I think that's
covered. In 5 minutes.
It's always 5 minutes with us.
We had Steve interrupting us and taking so much time. But thanks so much, Daniela. I really appreciate that, and I always love your input and advice. And everybody, Daniela from Araujo is one of my absolute best favourite attorneys and conveyancer. And of course, I love your daughter more than I love you.
I know, everyone does. Everyone does.
But yeah, thank you very, very much, everybody, and happy 2023. And see you next Thursday. If you've got any questions in between, just pop them through on email, on Instagram. Thanks everybody for all the interaction in between. I've really loved it. And also my daily stories. If you want to just have a look at what I'm doing every day, just remember to check out the daily stories. So ciao for now.
Bye.
Bye.